Hi everyone, today I'll be talking about Shadow, which is a very much overlooked piece of Wayland ice, and I'll be talking about it in the context of Grundle. This also kind of applies to Wayland building a better world, but since I've been playing a lot of Grundle recently, I like to talk about it in the context of a Grundle rush deck. So, Shadow. Why play Shadow? I find that Shadow is a very useful early game ice. It's the only piece of ice in my entire suite of ice that does not have an end run subroutine. Everything else is cheap end run or archer. Shadow's the exception. And the very fact that I included it, even though it doesn't have an end run subroutine, means that it must be pretty good, and it really is. The first question that most of you will have on your mind is why play Shadow when you can play Hunter? Hunter is very, very similar to Shadow. Let's say the runner encounters this piece of ice unrest and does not have a sentry breaker out. So both ice essentially cost the same to rest because Shadow will give you a 2 credit rebate. Then both ice do the same thing. They trace for 3 and if successful they give attack. The difference is Hunter has a strength of 4. Shadow has a strength of 1 but can be advanced. So why would you play Shadow in a deck that doesn't rely on advancement counters? Think of it from the runner's perspective. Imagine you're a runner playing against Grundle and you see a Hunter on the board. The next time you want to run, you ask yourself, can I get through Hunter? No, I can't, but I can just trace for it. And even if the corp succeeds in the trace, I'll just spend the next click removing the tag. That's all. So essentially, to make a run, all I need to do is to spend 2 clicks and 2 credits. If I'm really that desperate to make a run, the cost is cheap. However, with Shadow, the runner now has to ask themselves, am I willing to give the corp 2 credits and spend 2 clicks and 2 credits to remove the tag just so that I can make a successful run? Now that changes things. All of a sudden, Shadow becomes a double pop-up window. Now that's fierce. Against Wayland, it's always important to stay afloat on credits. As you know, Seesaws and mid-seasons all rely on credits, as does Punitive Counter-Strike. Giving the corp money is definitely something you don't want to do. This improves the deterrence factor of Shadow. Runners are much less likely to run through Shadow without the appropriate sentry breaker. Whereas with Hunter, it's very easy to convince yourself that running through Hunter is the correct decision, because the consequences of suffering the Hunter's subroutine is just too little. Furthermore, with Hunter, it is very unlikely that bringing out a sentry breaker would make it cheaper for you to run through Hunter. This is because with a strength of 4, Hunter cannot be easily gotten through even by the best of sentry breakers. Mimic requires a data sucker token and 1 credit at the very least. So all in all, you would much rather just run through Hunter without any icebreaker and lose attack manually. Whereas for Shadow, as long as the runner does not have an icebreaker out, they will find it very hard to justify making runs on Shadows repeatedly, giving the corp 2 credits each time. It effectively acts as an end run. After the runner encounters it blind, they will avoid running into the Shadow again until they have the sentry breaker out. So in essence, it acts just like a convey, just like an ice wall, except that they let the runner through the first time. It being the cheapest sentry that has this function is the reason why I'm using it. There aren't many cheap end-run sentries out there, so Shadow for Grundle and Wayland is definitely the best bet. Especially in Wayland because of Scorched Earth in general. Runners will be very hard-pressed to find reasons to keep tags against Wayland, so Shadow works very, very well in this regard. Now we move on to the corp's perspective of Shadow. Let's say the runner just made a run on one of your servers protected by a Shadow. You rest the Shadow, you gain 2 credits back, and you initiate the trace. How much should you trace for? For most corps, the natural instinct is to not bump the trace. If you are not NBN making news, you have no reason to lose credits for a trace that the runner might not beat. If they don't beat the trace, you are just wasting your credits to obtain the same effect. But with Grundle, and to some extent, Wayland building a better world, it is quite different. Due to the explosive economy in operation-based Wayland, it is very, very likely that credits don't matter that much to the corp as much as they do to other factions, because Waylands are normally flooded flush with cash, and they can always afford to spend 1 or 2 more credits to bump the trace. In this regard, bumping the trace actually becomes an important factor because it can influence the runner's choice, whether they choose to beat the trace or let it go. And in most cases, bumping the trace up is actually the better play. Let's analyze this. So we know that it costs 1 click and 2 credits for the runner to break the tag. Assuming they don't want to keep tags, if they only need to pay 2 to break the trace, of course they will do that any day over losing the trace and then having to shake the tag later anyway for 2 credits and an additional click. So what you want to do is to bump the trace up such that they have to make a difficult decision. Do they shake the tag manually or do they pay the extra credit to get through? Giving the runner choices isn't a very good idea, but when you're the corp and you have the money to spend, it is often better to give them tougher choices than to let them go scot-free and just pay 2 credits to get through your server. In this scenario, for example, if I were playing Grindel and I was facing, say, a Gabriel with 0 link, I would bump the trace up to trace 4. So he will have to either spend 3 credits to get through or shake the tag manually. If it's a 1 link runner, like Andromeda, which is far more common, they will only need to pay 1 credit to get through to beat the trace. In that case, to incentivize them to pay more, I would have to pump more credits into the trace. And that might not become worth it. If I need to pump 2 or more credits into the trace, I risk losing them for nothing, and it's probably not so good an idea unless I'm really flooded on cash and have nothing better to do with it. If you are playing Building a Better World and you don't start with any bad publicity, your choices become much clearer and much easier because the dilemma for the runner becomes harder. So generally, you won't have to bump the trace up by that much, if at all. So yes, the next time the runner encounters your shadow or any other trace ice for that matter, I think it's a very good idea to put yourself in the shoes of the runner and ask yourself, would I pay to get through this trace? If the answer is yes, would bumping the trace change anything in the equation? One very good example is when you are playing trace ice against Gabriel Santiago and your trace ice is over HQ. Let's say the trace is end the run, something like Caduceus. If you do not bump the trace, all Gabriel has to do is to pay 2 credits, and then he'll get through to HQ, at which point he'll earn his 2 credits back. So as the corp, you're almost always going to bump the trace, unless you really need the credits. For example, if you're on 5 credits and you have a hedge fund in hand, or you're on 10 credits and you have a restructure. Otherwise, it's almost always worth it to bump the trace. Otherwise, you're never going to keep the runner out. With Shadow is kind of the same concept, except that the runner will get through in any case. It's just a matter of whether you're making it more expensive for them to run through or not. And Shadow uniquely allows you to do this. It's a function that no other ice, except for Enigma, I suppose, because Enigma causes the runner to lose a click. Ice Wall, Quandary, etc. All these don't cause the runner to lose much tempo. Shadow has this function, and you should take advantage of it as much as you can if you're including it in your deck. Thanks for listening. Hope you found this pretty insightful. See you around.